All right. Welcome back, everybody, to another Learning Tech Talks, where we are continuing to live at the intersection of business, technology, and the human experience. I am back after a much needed break. So, for those of you who were celebrating Thanksgiving, I hope you had a great Thanksgiving. It was nice to be off for a bit, but also looking forward to getting back. And we're coming back strong today. We are going to be talking about really some of the practical implications of where AI is starting to transform work. And for those of you, just a quick update for those of you who aren't subscribed to the Substack, if you do not catch the full conversation and you want to catch the sound bites or the biggest highlights, make sure you're subscribed to that so you can catch those afterwards. But today, the long form conversation is I'm having this with Josh Penner. And he is riding both sides of the fence in that he's running a technology company focused on AI while at the same time running a team of 50 and navigating what it looks like for work to change as well. So Josh, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, Chris. Happy Thanksgiving late and happy to be here.
Yeah, happy late Thanksgiving. And I forget, where are you located?
The Pacific Northwest. The further away you get from Seattle, the more you just say Seattle. But let's just say Seattle.
So, unrelated to our topic, it reminds me a little bit of when I lived in the Chicago area. I say Chicago area because to anybody who was in Chicago, when I told them what suburb I lived in, they're like, "You don't live in Chicago. That is not Chicago whatsoever." But to anybody else outside of Chicago, if I said, well, I live in this suburb, it's kind of here between, they're like, oh, so you live in Chicago. So I just started saying Chicago, but then quickly found that only Chicago residents were the ones who took offense to me saying that.
That's fair. You know, it is relevant to this conversation to say the exact city I live in, but of course, most people aren't going to know where it is. Most people in Washington State don't know where it is, but I'm from the city of Ording, which I'm the mayor of, which is part of this conversation, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And where's Ording? If you're in Washington State, you see Mount Rainier, if you could see the picture behind me. And
so even though it's a virtual background, it's a legit virtual background of where you physically are located?
Well, more or less. Anywhere between you and Mount Rainier is where Ording is, pretty much. So you fly into Seattle, you see Mount Rainier, and you look in Mount Rainier, you're seeing Ording, like mayor of the mountain. You can just call me like that's where I am.
Okay, I got it. All right, so mayor you're dual rolling this. So why don't you give me a little bit of background in this, because you've got this technology. Well, tell me a little bit about the company, but then also, like you said, you're also the mayor of your town, which I have to imagine that's straddling two sizable responsibilities.
It is, and it's important those responsibilities stay separated. But I'd say I know about the problem because of being the mayor, and I'm trying to solve it by being the CEO of this company. And so just, I'm the mayor of Ording. I'm also CEO of Inquisio AI. And what I know from being mayor is that information management in public agencies, municipalities, particularly cities, counties, school districts, fire districts, and such, is an absolute mess. And it costs us billions of dollars a year across the United States, just not being able to access information timely. And it's a big frustration point for our constituents. And no one is really solving this problem. And it seems amazing that no one is, but you start thinking about government, the terms you don't think about with government are innovation. And
yeah, those aren't normally two things that people synonymously put in a sentence.
Exactly. And that means that the things that in your private business you might come to expect, say a Copilot with your Outlook or something like that coming out, you're not going to really see the public sector grab onto that very quick. It took the public sector till easily the mid 2000s or maybe 2010 to make websites pretty standard for these agencies, so they were 10 years behind the curve on that.
So the change curve is a little bit significantly lacking, or at least you're just behind the curve a little bit more in the public sector.
Yeah, I make a statement, I don't know, it's a truthy statement at least, that governments, particularly cities and counties, are risk mitigation factories. Like, they exist to identify the least risky path and try to pursue it. And to do that, You typically have shared accountability, a very long process where you analyze, observe, do reports. It's expensive, but it's not as expensive as making mistakes. Like if you've
Okay.
got your own personal risk tolerance, imagine your government's risk tolerance is 1,000 times less.
Yeah. Well, and I think it goes back to one of those things where it's just a different approach to running things, in that,
Mhm.
high risk people with a high risk tolerance may spend less on overhead, process, things like that. But then those unexpected costs that can come when risk hits can be exponential versus, hey, like, let's mitigate any risk. I mean, I came from pharma, which is, again, I spent a good chunk of time there, low risk tolerance. There's high reward in some regards, but there's also a very low risk tolerance around certain things because the costs can be extremely high if you get it wrong.
Yeah. Well, I
Now,
mean, you see a relationship between that and the cost of doing business often.
right. Right. Now, my question to you is this: did you start with the, kind of interest in politics and getting into that local politics first, and then the company followed when you got in and went, wow, I see so much opportunity? Or was it the other way around? Did you get into the tech side of things and look at, hey, how can we optimize this? And then took that, which came first, chicken or the egg?
Yeah, that's a chicken and egg statement. Like I've always been interested in technology, and I've been a solopreneur for yeah most of my professional life, in one form or another, doing tech based work or marketing, but with a tech angle, that sort of thing.
Okay.
Um, this particular problem, that we're solving with Inquisio is this is 14 years after I've been elected, right? So
Okay.
the company in relationship to my experience in government is very new.
Okay.
Where I think we're just over a year old at this point.
Okay. Okay. Got it. Well, because that's what I was going to ask. So you've been mayor for 14 years, you said?
No, I was on the city council before that and a planning
Okay.
commission before that. And I've had other minor roles during
Okay.
that period as well.
Out of curiosity, because it's always interesting to me when I love having diverse conversations with people from all over the map. Was politics, local politics, always something that was of interest to you
In a way, I
in
didn't
a way?
know that I could. I didn't. I certainly had no personal vision of myself as being a council member or mayor or knowing what these things were. Like I think I fundamentally knew from a civics perspective what they were, but
Okay.
um, I'd always been interested in how people interact. One of the things I've learned in my role as mayor, as a council member before that, is most of what I learned in politics came from being in the Marines, being a E nothing in the Marines. We call it a Lance Corporal, which means you really have no rank. You do have to get things done though, and so it really relies on your ability to create relationships.
Okay.
If you think about, I don't know if you remember MASH,
Oh, of
the
course.
sitcom MASH, and
Sure.
Radar had like no rank. Radar O'Reilly is one of the main characters, and he had no rank, but he still
Yeah.
had to get things done. And so I mean, that's one of the underlying themes is the hijinks of him getting people to do things that outrank him, and that's what
Yeah. Yeah, because
being
he
an
really had
nothing.
no power or authority or hammer to,
Yeah,
gavel to bang to say this needs to get done. It was like, well, but I'm still responsible for getting this done. So I got to get really creative and leverage relationships and all sorts of things to actually accomplish what needs to be accomplished.
yeah, and that is the job. That's the job that I have to do. But if I was always interested in that, I don't know. I'd say that there was a lot of happy accidents in my life that led me to be in the right place at the right time. And I was still in the Marines, and I was running at night, and saw that there was an open position for council. Somebody had left the seat early, so the city council got to appoint a new council member in the interim. And I applied for it, and I lost. And I'm super competitive. And so I thought, well, this is a game I don't understand. I want to know the rules. So I showed up to every
I want to
meeting.
know the rules so I can win.
Yes, I showed up to every meeting, showed up to every committee meeting, all the different pieces. And I know it now looking in hindsight why the mayor asked me. It's because I was present all the time. But the mayor asked me if I would be interested in joining the planning commission, which is a pretty important volunteer opportunity
Okay.
in most communities. And I said yes, of course, and joined the planning commission, took another whack at council. This time, got elected to the council and spent 6 years as a
Okay.
council member, and then ran for mayor. And
Okay.
so I don't know that I was always interested in it. I think I had a tendency towards it, and that this has just been, a river that my boat is on at this point.
Okay. So, and part of why I wanted to give into some of the, backstory behind this is I'm always interested in some of the parallels that we see across things where, I talk to people from a lot of different industries, a lot of different backgrounds, and there can be a tendency to think, well, it's really different over here. The way we do things is different. The challenges we face are different. And in some cases, that's true. And then in other cases, you go, actually, that's a very similar problem to what's being solved universally. So I'm curious as you got into this, because I think this is going to help shape some of the discussion around where AI really has an opportunity to optimize some of this is as you got into it, you hit on it a little bit, but as you dug more into the municipal government side of things, what were some of those just straight up things that you went, why is this so hard? Or why is this so inefficient?
You know, one of the things that has been a learning experience for me, and we touched on it just briefly a bit ago about risk mitigation, is that much of the time our actions in government are centered around taking the least risky of two paths that have some
Okay.
inherent risk in it, or two, three, four paths. But you try to whittle down the number of paths you can take and try to find the least risky path. But at the end of the day, you may get sued. At the end of the day, you may, something may not work out. Some assumption may be extraordinarily wrong. And so a lot of the work that you do is about value proposition of how much do you expend to try to identify that least risky path. Do you
Okay.
commission a report or a study? Do you set off the time that you have to make a decision? Do you explore the what if I don't questions? At some point somebody has to make a decision, and you've got to move forward, but when do you have to do it? And I think for me, the aha moments really centered around why are we doing this way, and are we really thinking about it in net present value perspective? If we're going to commission this report and it's going to cost $100,000, is our risk profile of this decision more than $100,000? Something like that.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think those are the things that really got me thinking about why do we do things this way, and are there better ways to do it? And I think everybody goes into public service charging ahead. They put it in their voter profile, I'm going to change everything. And then you see it most of the time, they're not able to change anything, because reasonable, smart people before them also tried to change it or establish the
Had
system.
similar, right? It's not like nobody ever thought
Yeah.
about these same challenges and wanted to fix them.
I think that's one of the things that surprises me is that, and the system itself, it kind of tempers people. They go in
Yeah.
charging ahead. They don't realize they need to build a coalition of support, and then they're just one person on an island. They take two or three whacks by themselves and realize they're not moving forward. And then by the end of their term, they're typically just, marking time. And I'm not saying that to be cynical, but
No.
there's a process you need to learn in every organization and every structure. It's
Well, and I think based on what you're saying with this, and I think this is where there's some of these parallels to it, is the same is very true on the corporate sector. And the same is true on the higher education sector and the K-12 sector, having kind of worked across all of those, you see similar things where there are inherent problems. There are things that have just been built into the system. And it's not that people don't care or don't want to do anything about it. It's just that sometimes people have a struggle figuring out how, but then you will get someone who comes in and goes, well, I'm going to fix this by myself, and come in, Maverick, John Wayne, thinking they're just going to, fire some things off and boom, fix the system as though that's really all it's going to take, only to find themselves frustrated and going, okay, well, that didn't go quite according to plan.
Well, I think there's a big parallel here, and it really always comes down to execution. There
Yeah.
is no lack of great disruptive ideas. What there's a lack of is the execution on those ideas. And you'd say that for politics, you say it for private sector, is that,
Yep.
and I've had the privilege to experience both, is that you've got just this great churn of people in the public sector that are trying to introduce new ideas. They're going to do things different, but for some reason or another, they're unable to execute. But private sector too, you see the churn of companies come and go, and some of them catch hold and they change the world. And then 15 years later, they are actively campaigning
They're
to
the same.
regulate.
They're
Yeah, they're
well, and
campaigning to
sometimes
regulate
those
an
big ones
industry
that
so that
change
way
the
nobody
world at
gets
one
disrupted.
point. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I've worked for companies that were the game changers at one point that just over time became the curmudgeons that were actually inhibiting innovation in the
Mhm.
industry. They actually became the very thing that they set out to, disrupt when they first got their moonshot.
Well, I think we're making a good argument that maybe people need to have some sort of a clock to move on, right? I'm not going to suggest term limits or an age limit, and I'm just saying that maybe we all need to recognize in ourselves when it's time to move on.
Yeah. Yeah. So as you look at some of this stuff, because the reality is, and I actually want to go back to this risk mitigation thing, because so much of what you said about what some of these things are again, the parallels are very similar. And I think as we look at these, it'll start to help with some of the AI pieces, at least where I see AI coming in to help with some of this stuff. Because what you just described, going back to your example of, okay, we're considering doing this thing. Let's run a report. Let's get a report done on this. It's going to cost $100,000. And that's maybe not the exact same process you might see in the corporate or academic sector, but a similar type thing. We think we want to do this. And the way we always do it is we do this to mitigate XYZ risk, to assess the risk. In a corporate, it might be we bring in a consulting firm to do an analysis of, whatever. In academic, it may be something it's different, but it's really the same thing.
Mhm.
And going back to it, sometimes that question is never asked of, is the risk we're potentially mitigating in greater cost than what we're actually investing in, type of thing. It's almost just this inherent process that we go through to do something. And, as you look at this, where do you see some of these opportunities, or where, as you've done this in government and you've gone, what, hey, how do we get better at assessing some of those risks? Because I think risk mitigation and assessment is key no matter where you are.
Where do we get better at mitigating risk in a public sector,
Yeah,
or
like,
how do
so
we
as you
think
look
about
at some of these things and you look at what you're doing to try and improve this, what are some of the areas you're zoomed in on that? And in some ways, how are you
it? Sure.
seeing technology help with that?
Well, really the impetus behind starting the company was around an area where there's a tremendous amount of risk that is just simply unanswered right now. And we call it information access, but it comes down to every document that your government has, everything it creates every day. Let's say a city of 10,000 creates 500 documents a day, emails, social media posts, just notes or whatever, transcripts from meetings. All that stuff is a record that you typically, as a citizen, have a right to look at should you make the request.
Mm.
And a lot of people do make requests for basic information. There is,
Really? I mean, so
well,
this is fascinating to me in some ways. So, like,
yeah.
literally, all of those are considered public record that someone,
Mhm.
if they really had an interest, could say, I want to know what this is.
Yes, and I guess we're kind of setting it up as if, yeah, you might just want to see somebody's email, but typically these are driven by
No,
something,
yeah.
economic
It's driven by
interest, like,
somebody's trying to figure out
right.
what's going on.
Yeah, for some reason, and usually it's not antagonistic, but
No.
um, there is a big risk factor for these public agencies in not producing it, especially municipal agencies like cities, counties, school districts, and such. There's typically pretty hefty fines for failure to produce those records in a timely manner. It was Pierce County in Washington just settled a $250,000, settled for $250,000 on just some basic information. City of Tacoma, $5 million because they didn't realize that a records request had come in. And you add this up and you're looking at $500 million a year across the US just in fines for failure to produce these records. And then, that's on top of the $5 to $6 billion a year that we spend as cities staffing up to find these records. And you just keep adding the B's, the billions, the billions, billions. And this is an incredibly expensive problem that has a failure rate of 10%. And you wouldn't accept a 10% failure rate in anything. Why would you accept it for your government? And still nothing's being solved here. There has to be a better way to access information and provide it for the public. And if you're able to create a window into this information that people can access and understand and find what they're looking for, you're de-risking the 90,000 agencies across the US that are required to produce these records, right? You're creating massive de-risking in that environment.
Okay. So let me break this down and then we'll unpack this, because I think to me, this is part of, my goal in some of these future episodes that I have, including this one, to kind of help people see how you can deconstruct this stuff and reconstruct it in different ways. So if I'm understanding the problem statement correctly, similar challenges to in a corporate sector, but different in that, so anything created on a municipal government level or on a government level is technically public record, which makes sense. So let's say there's a zoning meeting about something and somebody's impacted by how new zoning laws are put in place. And they say, hey, I want to see the records for what this was so that I can better understand how this decision was made and what was discussed. Something like that. Like you said, it's not somebody going, I want to see Josh's email type of a thing, antagonistic. It's somebody who legitimately they're looking at building new commercial property. They want to see what the new zoning laws are, and they want to see how did we come to the conclusion on how we decided this type of a thing. So they put in a request, and there's an obligation as part of the municipal government to say, you need to be able to provide that, or there are consequences to that just based on how things are structured. And I can imagine that is massively time intensive and resource intensive, not only to create all of the records for literally everything you do, but then also the channels and the pathways for optimization of, well, how does that request come in? How do we make sure someone is there to get the request, process the request, then have to go find the information from wherever it is managed, then make sure that information gets back and the loop is closed. Is that a fair, at least to some degree, summary of the problem statement?
Yeah, I think that's a great summary. I would add that in any similar organization to the ones that we're talking about, you're going to see at least 10% of the staff is just dedicated to this records problem, and probably 20% of all staff time expended. So it's an amazing amount of effort.
So it's a large amount of human resources and just time and capital spent on people there to be available to find this stuff.
Oh, absolutely. And that's the internal cost. Every opportunity cost that your government takes also has a personal cost to the constituents, and opportunity lost as well.
Well, and I'm guessing, just based on our conversation so far, from a government standpoint, given low risk tolerance is a theme, the threshold, because in an organization that has a higher risk tolerance, they may then staff and resource it based on kind of the minimum, a very aggressive approach to how many people do we really need? And they might take a minimum viable approach. Government's probably not going to take that approach because that introduces too much risk. Is that fair? Because it'd be like, well, a corporation may go, we only need one person because chances are we're only going to deal with this. A government may say, I don't know that we want to run that thin, because if we get overburdened, the risk to our organization, if we don't have enough people resource to do this, is greater than it may be to a different organization.
But it's like water forming to the container, or liquid forming to the container it sits within. Is that you've got the different, 50 different states have 50 different sets of regulations, and how long you can take to prolong something out, and how you can delay it. And so I think an agency is going to staff the amount that they need to fit within those laws. And so if the laws say that you can delay something for up to 2 years, if you give them reasons, then you're going to have enough staff to get people things within 2 years. And
Okay. So you're
um,
baselining
yeah,
and doing workforce planning, just like any company, where you go, well, what is the time frame by which we have to do this? What's the volume of requests? What kind of resources might we need to be able to accommodate that?
I mean, you'd like to think that you're planning it out, but it more is a, you figure it out as you're going how many you need.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Got it. Got it. Well, and I mean, I think about this going back to, it's interesting. It brought me back to some of my days in pharma where I remember when the FDA would show up at, the facility and go, we're doing an FDA audit and we need to find, and literally there were people whose full-time jobs were to do nothing but be at the ready. So if FDA showed up, you're there to pull documents, pull people, schedule meetings, coordinate all these things. And it was a massive time suck. And again, there were
Yeah.
people who were dedicated to nothing more than just that. So we're talking about that on an even larger scale.
Yeah. Well, I can't talk about how big pharma is, but I can say it's the largest problem, I think, in local government across
Okay.
the U.S.
Okay. So then as you look at that, because I'm thinking about this, so you look at what you're doing with your company on the outside. To me, this just seems like ripe for technology to help, but I'm sure I'm sure you're also dealing with, and you've got this risk tolerance of, well, how much do we adopt new technology to solve some of these problems? So where are you looking at that now and going, how can we use technology to help with that? Because you're talking about, changing workflows, changing processes, changing the way people's jobs are structured.
Absolutely. We are trying to frame this, and the opportunity cost framework is that: would you rather have 10% of your staff chasing down records, or would you rather have them doing a higher quality work that you hired them for, and maybe be able to utilize some of that for additional, co-responders or police officers or parks people, whatever it is your vision entails. It probably doesn't entail people looking for records.
Yeah.
But yeah, and those people are incredibly important, but like, we don't have rooms of calculators either anymore, because we have the ability to have calculators. And so there is a time and point where emerging technology is going to change how we're doing work in government. I think that we need to embrace certain emerging technology faster, because the risks are coming at us much faster than previous evolutions of technology. The risk of mail fraud to mail is just like, you might lose $5. The risk of spam to email is you might lose a couple $1,000s, or somebody might get a password, and that could be detrimental. It's not world changing, but the risk of not adopting something in the emerging AI era that is roughly equivalent to what nefarious actors would use is catastrophic for organizations and probably for societies. And so I think that we in the public sector, the people that we're trying to build these relationships with to upscale their ability to integrate this new technology much faster than they previously have, it is a survival situation that they don't realize is coming their way.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and I'm curious how that's being received as you push some of this, because again, this is not a problem unique to the public sector.
mhm.
In terms of the number of conversations I've had over the last 12, 18 months, specifically just on this. I mean, AI has been coming and there have been disruptive changes happening for a long time. But I would say the last 12 months have probably been more intense than they have in quite a while, in terms of people legitimately going, fundamentally, my job is either they're viewing it as completely at risk or it's significantly at risk for disruption. I was just reading some research by LinkedIn about, how much generative AI is going to disrupt people's work. And I think that it was saying only 45% of people's skills are insulated from disruption to this. And I actually think that's a pretty conservative. I think that's a very conservative number. I would actually say I think it's much higher than that in terms of that. So as obviously you're, as the founder of this company, probably more bleeding edge than maybe other folks in the public sector. How's that being received by the people that you work with, where you start talking about, the implementation and the use of technology to potentially automate or eliminate work that people are doing today?
We were speaking at the League of California Cities annual conference, and a council member from, I think it was Los Angeles, asked one of my team members a question roughly around how does this work into displacement? This idea of, somebody doing a job is going to be replaced by this technology. And,
Yep.
we had to think about that, but it really comes down to, and I can't speak to other sectors, but I'm going to assume most people feel that they're oversubscribed. I can tell you
Yeah.
in the public sector, every one of us has, I don't know, 2 or 3 times as much work as we can get to. And so we're
Yep.
constantly in a state of triage. And, our state of triage has to be measured and identified, and we have to produce it for records purposes. But it is still just way more work we can get to. And to the extent that we have at some point the equivalent of a small staff, a virtual staff working for us through these tools, we can get to that work faster and do better at doing it. Like, we can do the work better and faster and address that mountain. Now, are we creating bigger mountains with AI in the back end? Probably too. So,
Yeah.
but I think when we talk to other communities, there is the concern of, well, what's this gonna, is this gonna displace our entire staff? And I think that you got to be honest that yes, there's going to be a change in the makeup of your staff at some point. But the work still needs to get done. And I think they ultimately, especially in municipal organizations, folks are mostly pragmatic. They exist in their roles to solve a problem that is defined by some law somewhere.
Yeah.
And having better tools to do that are resistant to I'd say the antagonistic actors that are trying to move against those rules, are seen as very helpful. So the public sector right now is starting to really wrestle with what's a good policy. And so you've got your laws and you've got your policy, which is like how you carry out the laws. There's no law that really takes into account AI, because
That's why I was curious how you're handling that, because that's a challenge that I think even any sector right now is dealing with. Is most companies don't have good policies, or law, whatever you want to call them in your organization, governing what do we do about this? And I've seen companies go from one extreme to we're just cutting the cord to any sort of generative AI technology, which I think is a fatal mistake.
It's pretty stupid, but whatever.
It's pretty stupid, but you can do it. I guess you can say we're not going to. But I've seen other ones just go, well, this is just so ubiquitous, we're just not going to do anything. And I think that's a mistake too, because it's just leaving people to figure things out on their own. But I know that you're in an industry that the stakes can in some ways be higher, or it can be more complicated to navigate. So how are you navigating some of those policies around, well, what do we do with this to start to mitigate it, so we don't just say, well, this is just too much?
Well, I think what I see right now is everyone's looking around to see what emerges from, the milieu. And like City of Seattle issued a policy statement on AI that was, pretty decent, actually. It talked about some of the potential risks, and a process for implementing new tools in the organization, and how they have to go through the organization's rules or processes, even if you buy like a $5 add-on to your browser, that sort of thing. The other extreme is like the state of Maine, that put a moratorium on anything generative AI, which is, and I said stupid, but I'll just plant my flag and say it's my opinion that it's foolish to be too hard in the extreme on any particular aspect of this, because everything is so new. I guess the way I look at it in my organization, and I can only speak for my perspective, is that personal responsibility is not obfuscated by implementation of new tools. And I can't imagine a policy around Grammarly usage or spell checks usage. But those tools dramatically improve my staff's ability to communicate and my ability
Yeah.
to communicate.
Yep.
And they are de facto an editor in somebody's pocket, right? They're a staff of
Yep.
one in your pocket that you utilize to improve your communication. And even Grammarly right now, like there's a AI integration with Grammarly, and
Oh, I know.
I haven't used it, but
Grammarly Go is
yeah,
a fairly effective generative AI add-on to Grammarly to actually help with your communication abilities.
right. And that's how quickly and subtly this stuff is starting to integrate. So the idea that we're going to just, cut the cord on generative AI and our tool usages, that's kind of where my flag planted of stupid is that you're going to tell me
No,
that you
I
don't
would
just
agree.
have to,
I would agree that foolish,
yeah,
yeah, if we want to use a more, politically correct term, like
sure,
I would say foolish is just the way to do it, because I've talked to organizations who've said, well, we've just banned Chat GPT. And I go, if you think that conclusively has blocked generative AI from your organization, you do not understand how pervasive this technology is in just about anything. I mean, I just even think the platform I'm streaming on right now, LinkedIn, you go to write a message in LinkedIn messaging, there's a thing that can say, hey, help me generate a response to this type of a thing, or write a post, help me create a post. So to try and simply say we're just going to not do it is foolish.
right. I think, the long-term policy ultimately is going to come down to where people in your organization belong in the mix, and they ultimately are the agent of responsibility always. And just like if you were to send out a piece of communication, maybe you're a director and you're communicating with me or to the public, and it had spelling errors and grammar errors and math errors, I wouldn't blame the computer you're typing it on.
No.
I wouldn't blame your staff. It wouldn't be your clerk. It wouldn't be your 5 employees that you have on your team that are responsible for that. My focus and the public's focus, well, the public's focus would probably be on me, but my focus would internally say, one, why didn't I catch this before it went out? But two, what is do you know how to write? Is this something that we missed? Do we need more education? Like, there's a person in there. I'm not looking to fix the computer.
Yeah.
With AI, there might be a little bit of, can we adjust the model? Is there some error with the model? But there should always be an agent of responsibility that's a human, right now, at least, in the mix. And I think that is more sustainable policy that is going to be more future proof than, let's say, this technology is what we're running forward with. This one, we're not going to. We don't know what the technology is going to look like in 12 months. This is faster than
no.
.com.
And if the last 12 months have been
media.
any indication of
Yeah.
what things are going to look like, it's impossible. I was asked the other day on a panel, where do you think we'll be in 6 months? And I'm like, I've got some reasonable predictions based on what I'm seeing and what I'm interacting with. But to be quite honest, if you'd asked me at the end of 2022 if I thought we'd be where we are today, I would have had no inclination that it was going to move as fast as it did. So any prediction right now is limited at best.
Yeah, we need to think about systems and not the technology. Systems meaning the systems of people.
I think it's interesting you bring that up, because even going back to what you brought up earlier about, I mean, there is some legitimate fear from people about, well, what does this mean for my job and the future of the work that I do? But no matter, I mean, and I've seen some of the latest and pretty advanced stuff, and even with all the progress we've made, AI is still largely pretty stupid. I mean, it really is.
Mhm.
It's intelligent, but again, going back to the human oversight, and we still have not quite figured out an accountability model for AI either. And I think that's one of the other challenges we have. And going back to it, if an email goes out, well, it doesn't matter if it was AI generated. We still don't blame the computer, because at some point someone should have seen, reviewed, said, hey, signed off. There needs to be some level of human accountability and involvement, or the whole thing falls apart.
It's kind of curious that we're talking about these advanced tools that are doing amazing things and growing in capacity by orders of magnitude each year. But the consistent solution seems to be a reversion to personal responsibility and accountability and basic leadership fundamentals.
It does.
It's like the solution for some of this is to look inward and look at human development as a solution that is sustainable rather than putting limits on how technology will be utilized. So to me,
Yeah.
I think that's a very curious aspect of this.
Well, it goes back to, as I look back over my entire career, some of my greatest innovations by technological standards would not have been very innovative at all, because just like what you said, where the true innovation came in was the development and the accountability and the going back to really, okay, let's make sure people are doing the right thing, personal responsibility, understanding and decision making and all these different things. It's like, we get that right, well, the technology will follow, but it does it in exponential components versus incremental steps, because the people are able to actually unpack it at levels that they couldn't otherwise.
Yeah, these are symbiotic relationships. A company is a symbiotic relationship with whatever the technology it's building, and people in that company exist to move it forward, as well as the tools that the company uses exist to move it forward. But same with governments. I mean, heck, that's what a family is to some degree.
Yeah.
There's a purpose behind all these systems, and there's a symbiotic relationship between the people and the systems and whatever tools they implement. And I don't think that perhaps there's an AI that's able to build a company in the next 5 years. I'm curious how that works. An AI that builds a company that requires human interaction. I don't know. I mean, that's the bleeding edge of things. Is, can you create a whole economy of non-human tools? Can tools sell to tools and create structures around the way the tools communicate with each other? I don't know. Probably at some
I think
point.
the challenge with it is, and I've talked to some of these folks who are on the edge of this stuff, and the challenge they continue to run into with going too far with it is, one, the data continues to show people plus artificial intelligence consistently outperforms
Mhm.
people or artificial intelligence by itself.
Oh yeah.
Consistently outperforms it. It just, there's no data that shows otherwise. So they run into that challenge. But then on top of it, nothing is in isolation. And so really at the end of the day, even a company ultimately is interacting with people from a product standpoint. And
Mhm.
so the idea that you can create something that has no human involvement, that ultimately interacts with people and delivers a product to people and services to people, it ends up falling apart. And so what they continue, at least to date, the folks that I've interacted with who have even done progressive things like, well, we're going to have a AI CEO. And it's like, well, but our whole structure is based on the AI CEO, but ultimately there's a board of advisors that have to. And it's like, well, so you still have people involved in the whole thing. You haven't ultimately eliminated that variable yet. And I have yet to see anything that demonstrates that that's going away, period.
I don't, and this is just me off the top of my head, I don't think I've ever seen one algorithm that replaces one person in one organization. Like if you look at leadership books, like the CEO, an algorithmic CEO, what leadership style did they ascribe to? How do they take input? Do they lean more towards authoritarian or collaborative? Which one's right? And when they do that, the next company over that's in competition, uh, should they be the exact same way, or should they try to identify weaknesses and chip away at that moat using a different style? And so the idea that you're going to have one algorithm that dictates one person's role in an organization is fantasy to me. And I know that like that's what sells books. Somebody will come out with 11 steps to be a
Sure.
great leader. But
Yep.
there are so many
The
different ways.
dynamic nature of the way the world works just
Yeah.
doesn't work like that.
I think there's some underlying themes.
Sure.
But there is other themes. There are other ways to do it. There are a lot of ways to do it. And who's to say what's successful?
Yeah, no, well, and I think and then you stack on top of that, going back to the accountability piece of it, just again, in a hypothetical state, right? If we had an algorithmic political leader or an algorithmic CEO,
Mhm.
when things hit the fan, what do you do about that then? And it creates this new set of problems of, well, can you fire an algorithm? If so, how? And what does that
Sure.
look like? And how does that actually give, again, you're still dealing with people, because people want to feel like somebody's been held accountable for these decisions. And saying that we tweaked our algorithm, it's not the same as, well, we've ousted the CEO, or this person is no longer in political power and we've brought someone else in that you've decided on, type of a thing. There's, again, I've yet to see this play out in ways where I go, yeah, I can see this actually fundamentally replacing people. And to your point, I have yet to, and I've explored a lot of industries, lots of jobs, the one-to-one correlation of, so we can get rid of this one person by simply replacing them with AI. It's like, no, we can deconstruct their work and we might repurpose them. And yes, maybe we don't need as many people doing this many tasks, but the one-to-one conversion rate just doesn't, the math isn't there.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the risk in the report, the risk report thing that we talked about earlier about what's the value. And at some point, I'm thinking back to economy classes too. Like, there's got to be the general view of a board or whoever determines CEO in your organization, or voters, right? At some point, there's some view that the risk of switching horses is less than the risk of staying with the same one. And I don't know that we can calculate that. I think just like an economic model, it exists on a graph, but in reality, it's just kind of
In
this
reality.
this kind of mess of feelings.
Yeah.
Some plurality of gut feelings moves an entire direction of a company. So,
Right. Yeah.
yeah,
No, it's an interesting, and again, who knows? Have this conversation with me 12 months from now. I'm sure if we were to revisit this conversation, there would certainly, I think, be things that may adjust and adapt based on the conversation. But I think there are still some things that would reign true, because I still just, I have not been convinced of some of the things that, again, they make good books, they make good headlines, to say, hey, in 10 years, we're all going to be sitting on a beach because AI is going to be running the world. And it's like, yeah, I mean, maybe that'll get a lot of clicks, but I've yet to see in practice anything play out that demonstrates that's a legitimate possibility.
I think just future casting here, and I'm an optimist, is that we don't have a lack of anything because we have moved people out of um, roles that could be automated. In fact, we've created much more opportunities for employment and organizations and activities through that behavior, because we're allowing people to build up to a different layer of their abilities. Right? Calculators, the NASA calculators, people in a room calculating, were incredibly important until they weren't. But that didn't stop. That didn't stop the need for good people to do good things and to do very critical thought. And I think
Yeah,
that
the work changed. I mean, ultimately,
when
that's what
yeah,
happened. The work changed.
when I think about my organizations and the public sector, is it is a massive de-risking in some ways, but it also is the ability of us to be able to utilize people in a role where they have a virtual team and they're able to accomplish, I think, things that they would like to accomplish. That is not just looking up files. And I'm not discounting the work, but
No,
it is.
no, because I think to your
Yeah,
point, and this goes back to the work that you're in,
right.
that work is important and has to get done. And there's not currently a better way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But if you were to ask people, is this the best use of your time? I think almost unanimously people would probably say, well, no. I mean, there are better things. Again, even going back to what you said earlier, it's not like anybody's sitting around going, if I didn't have this to do, there'd be nothing else to do. It's just a matter of, I have to get this work done. And because of that, there are other things I could get to, but I can't because of that. And so I think even just listening to some of the things you've described,
Mm-hmm.
it's rings true to a lot of the other things I see, where it's like, yeah, AI may be a great assistant to help public sectors in government automate and streamline a lot of that, go out, find this information so that people's time is spent more on, hey, making sure that we're getting the right information to the right people. Did they get what they needed? All of this, we speed that time up. We're able to provide a higher level of service and quality, but it's not necessarily saying, well, now we don't need anybody because we just have an AI mayor who runs an AI staff, and that's how our government's run.
Man, an AI mayor could be an interesting thing one day. An AI politician. I don't imagine people would trust them any less. So, yeah, that's it. Who knows? Like if you were that connected with technology, maybe there's some way to have pure democracy. Whether that's a good or bad thing is up for debate. But yeah, no, I think the theme here that's important is that you're not going to separate the two. Like you're not going to put the genie back in the bottle with AI.
No.
And AI is not going to be functional at replacing people entirely in organizations. And the best organizations are going to be those that utilize AI with great human talent in a symbiotic way. Just like a human punching a nail with their hand is not going to be as effective as a human hitting a nail with a hammer. Yep. It's just using a different tool to continue to advance what it is you're trying to do better.
Right. Well, and when we came out with power tools, construction workers weren't out of work. They just changed the way they did their work because there were power tools now that made things move quicker. So where are you on that journey now as you look at, I mean, obviously you've got your company, but as you look at the work you're doing in the public government sector, where are you on that journey now? Because as I continue to talk to people, they're in different stages of this.
Which journey?
The journey of kind of starting to explore and incorporate artificial intelligence into the work.
Oh man. Through the company, I hope that we are rapidly innovating and ahead of the adoption curve. I believe we are. We connect with a lot of communities, and the ones that have been to the workshops I presented or something like that, they've implemented some sort of a committee to look at AI use cases. But those, I think, are the leading edge communities. And in my city, we don't have AI as a dedicated process for anything. I utilize it personally for things that will save me, 5 or 10 hours here or there. And I know some members of my staff are kind of forward leaning in technology and are certainly toying around with how to implement it. There is no outside software that is dedicated for government that has fully integrated AI in any functional way yet. But hopefully I know a guy who's putting that together. But so I think right now we're still poking at the edges and really just reiterating again, the human piece of this is that should you implement this or should you utilize it, it is still your product. And that's internally how we've approached it, is just reiterating that ultimately, if you're the police chief, you're responsible for the things that come out of your department. If you're, the finance director, again, if you utilize this heavily, that's fine, but you still have to have an understanding of how it's being utilized.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you say that because there is this individual component to it, and then there's this collective organizational component to it. And, while you said that different industries are in different spaces, based on what you shared, seems to mirror a lot of what I'm seeing with a lot of different organizations I work with from all different sectors and all different industries, which is we're in this stage where a lot of people are experimenting with it on an individual level. They're figuring out, hey, this is where it really helps me with some of the work that I'm doing, type of a thing. The broader, more organizational, broad brush, like here's where it's affecting, universal policy or universal process in an organization, it's far more limited. And in many ways, I continue to see it almost being more effective, at least today, as an individual augment to an individual. Like it's almost an augmentation to the individual as they figure out like these tools really help me with these kinds of tasks, because a lot of the work that happens right now is still largely happening through people. And so they really are the ones that know, well, this is what I typically do, and here's where AI can do that. And because work is often very dynamic, I haven't run into a lot of organizations that have almost universally said, here's where we've used AI to streamline this, and this is the platform we have that has automated all of these different things. It's still very early stage for, I think, a lot of people right now, despite the fact that we've seen AI mature so quickly over the last 12 months.
Oh, indeed. So there was a period of time where job postings would require that you knew Microsoft Word, Microsoft Excel. And I think that those job postings largely don't exist anymore. Like, it's just kind of assumed that if you're in this environment, you know that technology.
You know how to use Office tools.
Right. And so there was a period of time where that wasn't, in 1980, you didn't have a job posting, or 1990, you didn't have a job posting that said you need to know Microsoft Word. Probably there for 10, 15 years between 95 and 2010, job postings, resumes would require those skills. Now it's kind of assumed. I don't think we've reached the point where job postings require AI skills. And some point here in the next couple of years, that is going to be, you'll need it on your resume.
Yep.
At some point, a couple of years after that, is just going to be assumed that you know how to do it. And so right now, it hasn't even hit our job postings yet. So how are we doing as an organization? We're aware, poking around, people are playing with it, but there's been no systemic integration of AI in really any organization I know about that's not an AI company.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's funny you say that, because it's going to be interesting to watch how this happens. But I would agree with you that that's probably where we're going to start to see this stuff start to integrate first is, as part of people's jobs, there will just become this rising expectation that, yeah, we may not have a system or a process that we specifically explicitly say, here's where we do it. But we do have an underlying assumption that for you to get this job, you should be familiar with generative AI tools. You should be using them as part of your regular discourse. You should know how to interact with, doing basic prompt engineering, some of these things to be able to assist you with your work. And I think we're just in that early stage, but I think it's a great opportunity for people who are thinking about this, whether you're in government, corporate, academic, it doesn't matter where you are, to go, these are the real skills that you can start to build today that are actually going to future-proof you for the beginning. And that's a lot less scary, because if you ask somebody now, hey, if you don't know how to use Office tools, you're probably not going to get a job, or you're going to struggle to find a job. Nobody freaks out and goes, oh my gosh, the world's changing around me. And I think that's where we're going to be. And I think the timeline's going to be much shorter, but probably in the next few years.
I try to put in my slide deck for workshops at conferences, and anyone who wants a speaker on AI and its intersection at conferences, I'm open to it, and I enjoy having these conversations. But I try to put in there, AI is not going to replace your job. Probably it's somebody using AI, somebody that has made it part of their tool set is going to be what's going to replace you. So that's, I think we go back to AI as this kind of like Skynet type technology. That's not, I don't think that is a reasonable fear. I think the reasonable fear is, are you going to be outpaced by somebody who's integrated it into their own personal workflow faster?
Yeah. Which, when you look back at the history of technological innovations, that's historically how it's always played out. So it's not unreasonable to think the same thing is going to be true. I mean, back in finance, the people who were learning Excel, instead of using their, ledger books, the first people to start doing that were the people in finance who were most marketable as things changed, because they knew how to be more efficient and more effective. They were able to do these things. And, it just was one of those same things. That seems to be the overall trend that I'm seeing, regardless of industry and sector that people are in right now.
Well, that's the engine of any economy, is value, the value proposition, and demand for that value proposition. And people are still the most important commodity in any organization. I wouldn't even classify people as a commodity in most cases, right? Like, people are the most important aspect of any organization. And we are, I think talking about decommoditizing some people and turning them into, a very valuable tool that's up leveled through connection with these tools.
Yeah, I actually think based on my assessment of things, the more AI continues to rise, the more valuable people will become because of the unique value proposition they will bring to the organization as AI automates some of these things that there's a lot of non-value add activity that people are doing in any organization. I mean, you described some of the stuff happening in government. I can tell you from
Mhm.
academic and corporate sectors, there's a lot of stuff intertwined with work that is just non-value add, and AI taking that out actually increases the value proposition of the work that's still being done by people. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, like I said, maybe we'll have to revisit this conversation in 12 months and see if our minds have been radically changed. I don't think they will, but it's going to be interesting to see. And I think it's awesome that you're looking at how technology can optimize and streamline. Like you said, you made it as a joke in the beginning, but government is not necessarily known for innovation and optimization like that. And I think the fact that you're leaning in on that is fantastic. So keep up the awesome work.
Well, thank you. In 12 months, you can talk to the algorithmic mayor and let me know how it goes.
I'll do a podcast with the algorithmic mayor of your city. So, well, Josh,
Go ahead.
go for it. No,
I was
what
going
were
to
you gonna say?
there's this, so my company's part of Techstars, if you're familiar with it, but it's a
Yep.
cohort of companies that one of them is really advanced with AI voice generation.
Okay.
And I think their name is Talk It right now. Um, and they took audio of me in a meeting, and I just gave them audio of me, and then I gave them a script. And so I try to terrify cities with, like, imagine your mayor leaves this voice message on your answering machine and asks you to do these things. This isn't just go get me a gift card. This is their voice asking you a question. And so, you know, already some tools can mimic my voice and my own unique phrasing of words and how I speak. All you need is a script.
Yeah.
And so maybe you can have an interview with an algorithmic me here in 12 months. I wouldn't put it outside of the realm of reality.
The thing with it is I wouldn't put it outside the realm of possibility. In fact, I've got someone who I've got a plan to actually have a three-way conversation with two of us and an AI bot. But the thing with it is my interactions continue to be, they are far less interesting than people. And it's
Yeah.
really only when people are behind the curtains pulling the strings that it's actually interesting to see what happens. So it's a unique and distinct future we have ahead of us, but I'm looking forward to it. I'm neither optimistic nor pessimistic about it. I'm just more, we're going to see some not
Let's
so
see.
great things, and we're going to see
Watch.
some amazing things. It's going to
Indeed.
be both. All right. Well,
Yeah.
Josh, thank you so much for the time and for joining me. Thanks everybody for watching and listening. And yeah, I hope you have a great rest of your week. We will be back next week.
Thank you, sir.